Children of the Stones by Jeremy Burnham and Trevor Ray. Chapter 10. Adam led the others through the village. Each of them struggled with the confusion of thoughts thrown out by the sequence of events of the day so far. The sun threw long morning shadows still, and yet so much had happened. Most important of all, to die. His behavior, when he had broken the talisman, his subconscious realization that Kevin had been happy-dayed, his fall and disappearance worried Matthew, who had no wish to lose yet another friend. Lyle's behavior over the glove business reinforced Adam's belief that, in some way, Matthew had been right in his psychometric experience, but without knowing exactly what had happened to the doctor and his son last evening. There was no way of telling for sure how they had been got at, as Sandra put it. He only knew that somewhere Hendrik had a hand in it, but how and why remained a mystery. Perhaps the mystery. The circle curved away in the sunlight, old and yet new, and surprising each time. There were meanings in the relationship of each stone to the next, Matthew felt sure, but meanings hidden in the mind of the priests who originated the project centuries ago. If only in some way he could enter into the mind of such a priest, maybe through his psychometric trick. A frightening thought. Matthew aimed slightly right of the line Adam was taking across the center of the circle, and the others adjusted their steps to follow. Matthew knew that the fallen Sarsen was in the ditch exactly in line with the avenue beyond. Adam joined him at his shoulder and grinned. The excitement was mounting in the little group. Matthew grinned back at his father. It felt almost like a race to find the Sarsen first. They were almost in a line as they came to the edge of the inner ditch and looked down. The great earthwork towered beyond the ditch in the sun, still low, threw a heavy shadow down to where the Sarsen should have been. Margaret gasped, almost as though she knew what she was going to see. She wound her arms protectively about Sandra and tried to turn her daughter's head so that she would not see the dreadful sight. Adam watched Matthew carefully out of the corner of his eye. The boy turned pale, but there had been a certain inevitability about this discovery, a certain knowledge somewhere inside him that this was what he would find. At the bottom of the ditch, deep in the shadow of death, were the crushed remains of his friend, Di. Adam and Matthew slid carefully down into the morning dark. From beside the body, Di looked like a bundle of old rags. There was nothing that reminded Matthew of his friend. Adam reached forward gingerly and gathered a few objects together. He stared down into his hand at them, turning them over and over. Without a word, he handed them to his son. They were the fragments of Di's disc. Like Di, there was no life in them. The boy realized suddenly how cold it was out of the sun. Highfield House had the nearest telephone, Adam decided. Hendrik's house. He cut fast across the circle. The great stone house came nearer, its twisted chimneys high above the surrounding walls. Adam saw a narrow door set in the wall and tried it. Creaking, it gave a little, and he realized he was looking into a beautifully tended kitchen garden. The door would only open a few inches, but was being held shut by a pile of seed trays and roof tiles, the sort of day-to-day debris of an old house. He put his back to the door and kept pushing until the old oak opened enough to let him squeeze through. He hurried along the gravel path to the wrought iron gate on the far side of the vegetable plots. Suddenly, The house was close. He had saved minutes by not going around to the main gates. Adam sprinted across the lawn and stopped under a great cypress, which looked as old as the house. The gardens were deserted, but a face at the first-floor window was watching him. Impassively and disturbing, a gaunt, suave face. He pulled at the bell of the main door, and far within the house he heard movement. Footsteps approached without hurry, and Adam pounded his fist against the iron-studded oak. The great doors slowly swung back, and the tall figure of Link, Hendrick's manservant, stood aside to let him in. "Hendrick, is he here?" "I will see." The door closed on well-oiled hinges. "Come on, man, it's urgent." Adam was conscious of looking fraught and disheveled. "Where's your phone?" He cast his eye around the paneled hall. "If you'll just wait here, sir." The manservant shimmered away into the recess of the house. Adam, totally alone, felt some of the urgency drain away. It required an effort of will on his part to ignore the polished luxury of the fine house and the aura of calm and content that it displayed. The fine old Tompion lung case startled him out of his reverie as it started the whirring that led to its chiming the quarter hour. Adam checked it against his watch and caught sight of its counterpart on the high mantel. A digital, electronic timekeeper flickered 8-figure information while looking utterly out of place. The telephone stood on the bureau, and Adam grabbed the receiver and dialed 999. Hendrick appeared, pleasantly expansive. "Adam, what a pleasant surprise." Nothing much was happening on the telephone. Unsure what ringing tone, if any, a countryside village could supply for its emergency services, Adam hung on for a moment. The phone did not feel dead. It was simply that nothing was happening. Adam was beginning to feel slightly foolish in his man-of-action guise. He had better explain himself. "There's a man, that Welsh poacher. He's dead." Hendrick's smile slipped for a second. "Dead? Are you sure?" "Of course I'm sure. I've just seen his body. By the earthwork, it appears to have been crushed by some enormous force." Hendrick frowned. "An accident." Adam beat at the receiver wrist and muttered into the unresponding telephone. He waved it at Hendrick questioningly. Ignoring Adam, Hendrick collapsed into a comfortable armchair and shook his head wonderingly. "Poor old Di." "Still, there's no escaping one's destiny, is there?" He smiled up at Adam's puzzlement. "Remember that poem of Francis Thompson's? I fled him down the nights and down the days. I fled him down the arches of the years. I fled him down the labyrinthine ways of my own mind. And in the midst of tears, I hid from him, and under running laughter." Still smiling, he said, "There's no escape, is there?" Adam replaced the receiver. "We ought to inform the police. Where's the nearest station?" For a long moment, Hendrick stared into the empty fireplace as though wondering what to do. Then, lightly and quickly, he moved across the room and picked up the telephone receiver. He jiggled the rest. "Police. My dear fellow." With his smile, he should have been in politics. "I don't think we'll need to involve them. Do you? What if he died of natural causes? We'll get hold of Dr. Lyle." He replaced the receiver with finality and, turning, said kindly, "I'm afraid you didn't have an outside line." Adam stood his ground. There was something amiss here. The police will have to be told. Hendrik took his arm comfortably and familiarly, easing him gently toward the door. I'll tell you what. Let's go and take a look. Make sure we're not making any mistake. There could be no mistake. Adam was certain of that. Di was dead. At the door, Hendrik let Adam lead the way into the brightness of the sunlit morning, saying, As the local J.P., I suppose I represent the majesty of the law in Milbury. Margaret and Sandra walked slowly ahead of Matthew between the stones. It was difficult to comprehend the meaning that lay behind the series of events that was driving them all toward an unknown area. Matthew was aware in his own mind that the circle of life around himself and his father was narrowing, quickly. Too quickly to understand, far too quickly for comfort. Matthew glanced again at the fragments of Di's talisman, which he felt had the answer. He heard Margaret say, Let me get this straight. You saw Di fall from the earthwork, and when you got there, he'd disappeared. There was just a fallen stone, with a serpent carved on it. They were nearing the village now, passing the last great sarsen. A serpent, like the one in the amulet, asked Margaret. Sandra tossed her hair back nervously. Exactly the same as on the barber surgeon's clay disc, the same as on the font in the church. Matthew stopped, as though he had been struck. Staring at the towering stone, he pointed to the unmistakable mark upon it. And exactly the same as that. Sandra and Margaret followed his pointing finger. Carved deeply into the rock was the symbol of the winged serpent. The sun died behind a cloud. As the manservant descended the great staircase, the silence of the house was broken only by the ticking of the long case clock. He stopped and opened the brass bevel, ignoring the whirring sound that indicated an impending chime, and keeping his eyes on the digital clock over the mantel. The figures flickered to the hour, and he moved the great minute hand back a fraction to agree exactly with its modern counterpart. Closing the glass face again, the tall figure moved off into the servants' quarters with the satisfied smile of a job well done. Adam shivered in the sudden gloom. The day had darkened perceptibly, and the breeze that had carried the sweet morning sharpness was now chilling. Hendrik, moving gracefully for a man of his size, led the way up the slight rise to the lip of the inner ditch. The empty inner ditch. Adam took a beat before the realization struck home. The ditch was empty. No crushed body, no great stone, just thickish grass, still wet with dew. Perhaps this isn't the place. Hendrik did not sound as though he believed himself. Grimly, Adam checked his line. This is the place, all right. Hendrik smiled. Come now. This is a civilized community. We're not body snatchers. Adam slid down the face of the ditch, down where the sparkle of the morning had turned rank and damp. Carefully he parted the grass at the place where he had found Di, exactly at the spot, hardly visible, covered with moss and lichens, was a low rock outcrop with roughly the same contours as a small, scraggly, spread-eagled body. Trying hard to keep his justification out of his voice, Adam shouted up to Hendrik, He was here, and this rock wasn't. So what are you suggesting? Asked the astronomer, Someone removed him and put the rock in his place. He laughed gently at the absurdity. Adam stared down at the buried boulder. I'm not suggesting anything, he said more or less to himself. I just don't understand it. Hendrik turned away, high above him, a big, dark figure, against the sky. Well, anyway, old man, he obviously wasn't dead. The boulder appeared on Matthew's painting. It took him some time to realize that the rock depicted was at the very spot where Dye had tumbled from the earthwork, but allowed for small differences in perspective. His heart leaped with excitement. Here it is, that rock we saw, where we found Dye. There's something in the picture. Margaret and Sandra crowded over his shoulder and searched the painting. Matthew pointed to the spot. Margaret checked quickly with the charts showing the present position of the stones. There was no stone marked for that position. Nothing at all in the ditched area. But look! Matthew compared the painting with the chart. The one we saw on the way back, the sarsen with the serpent carved on it. It isn't painted into the picture. Sandra puzzled. But it is marked on the chart. They stared at each other, minds whirling. Margaret was the first to give up the struggle to comprehend the wheeling possibilities that the circle seemed to be presenting in confusion. Matt, how many figures are there in the painting? This was a new track, the aim of which was not at all apparent to Matthew. He shook his head. No idea. Margaret's voice was urgent. Count them! The manservant opened the great door, and Hendrik entered. Nothing untoward, I trust, sir. The gentleman seemed quite agitated. Hendrik grunted with amusement. You know what these scientists are, Link. Always looking for rational explanations. Link's face cleared. So, things are as they should be. Deep in the armchair, Hendrik made a decision. I shall be having another dinner party tonight. The manservant raised his eyebrows, but did not speak. The sooner we are all one big, happy family, the better, smiled his master. There are 4 of them to choose from, sir. 4 who haven't yet enjoyed your hospitality. You'll invite them all together? No. Hendrik considered. They must come in order of precedence. Link smiled down at his master. So, it's the ladies first. Hendrik smiled back. Precisely. 55, the words tumbled out of Matthew. There are 55 people in the picture. Margaret said softly. I thought there might be. Seeing Matthew's slight surprise, she explained. Now that you and your father have arrived, there are 55 people in the village. Sandra broke in. But the artist can't have known that. No. Margaret tried to word her next phrase carefully. But it's almost as if... The door opened, and Adam came into the museum. They all turned to him, but the thought continued, despite Adam's obviously troubled manner. As if what, Mum? As if the painting was some sort of prophecy. The moment hung in the air. Adam smashed it to the ground with his next words. It's gone. Dye's body. It's gone. Disappeared. Matthew's brain danced. So he wasn't dead. Denying the evidence of his eyes, Matthew's hope leaned toward the impossible. He was dead, said his father grimly. I'm no doctor, but he was dead. He watched his son admit the truth of his words, but the hope lingered in the boy's eyes. Matthew took the broken pieces of the clay disc out of his pocket and put them on the table before him. During the silence, he moved them about, trying to repair the pattern. Suddenly, he tightened. Dad, look! The boy moved over to the barber surgeon display case and slid back the protective glass screen. Margaret hurried across to him. What do you need, Matt? The fragments, the amulet. She took out the circular mounting which contained the remains of the clay disc and gave it carefully into the boy's hands. Matthew placed it on the table and, taking a piece of Di's disc, tried to match it in a gap in the mounted fragments. It fitted perfectly. Sandra whistled through her teeth. Go on, Matt, Adam urged. Try the others. Matthew chose a smaller piece and slipped it into the ancient jigsaw, and another, and another. Excitedly, he tried to complete the disc. The clay pieces did not even vary in color, and the breaks between the segments hardly showed. The final piece slotted into place, and Matthew snatched his hands away in pain and surprise. He stared miserably at his father. Adam felt his dismay. This too? Matthew nodded dumbly. He was afraid. Afraid of the responsibility. Afraid of what he had recreated. Afraid of the confirmation that this might give of Di's death. But he knew, too, that there was no way in which he could avoid the investigation of the amulet. No way in which he could deny the amulet the opportunity of communicating through him. He took the disc and, mounting into his hands, Adam, worried, said, Take care, Matt, without knowing how that could be done. Matthew tightened his fingers into the surface of the completed disc, into the body and heart of the solar serpent. The pain immediately sweetened into sound, and the light came. Yes, the static. The energy. It's there. Sandra was frightened by the ghastly change in Matthew. She half screamed as his staring eyes rolled up, unseeing, into their sockets. Margaret held her daughter tightly. Visitor. He had hardly made himself heard. His voice was secondary to the sense. Perhaps it was not his voice. Later, no one could be sure what it was they heard. Adam had some such thought beating in his head. He took a pencil and scribbled. Visitor. Visitor. Again. Matthew understood. Everything. The meaning and life of the circle. Reason and sense manifest. The stars coursed through his existence with the aching power of knowledge. No darkness entered the light of his mind. No death waited for the end of things. Only peace and sound, that fine purity of matter resolved into silver sound, turning to pain, slipping upwards into agony, the twisting shock of nerves drawn through steel into blackness, and the loss. The loss. He stared around at him. Margaret took the disc mounting from his trembling hand. Suddenly, his legs went, and Adam lifted him to a chair. Dad, what happened? What did I see? Adam held him close. He wiped the sweat away from his face with his hand. Do you remember, Matt, what you saw? Matthew searched among the lost, but all was dark. Nothing. I remember nothing. You spoke. You said words. Adam handed Matthew the notebook, and the words floated before him. He waited for them to trigger his mind back to that wonderful and terrifying place, but they were powerless pencilings on paper. Beginning, he read. End. Visitor. Bright. Shining. Circle. People. Village. Priest. Stones. Power. Always. Always. Meaningless words. He looked at his father and tried a grin. Pick the bones of that, then. Adam grinned back. We must pick the bones out of that. That's all we've got. He reread the jottings. Visitor, someone visiting the village. The priest, perhaps, suggested Margaret. A visiting priest. Stones. Power. Always. Adam shrugged. Always power in the stones? That makes sense, but bright shining circle? Matthew was glancing at the painting. It's not the circle that's bright and shining, he said slowly. It's something else. The priest, prompted Margaret. Or the visitor. Adam frowned. Sandra felt like she had to say something. A visitor, bright and shining. It sounded like something from a fairy tale. Adam leaped on the thought. Wait a minute. Visitor... guest? They waited. His excitement bubbled, and he fought hard to control it, to keep cool the workings of his intellect. A guest star. That's what they used to be called in the old days. His excitement was infectious. Explain, said Margaret. What was called a guest star? As he answered, Adam wished that the thought had never come to him. A supernova. The words died in his mouth. They stared at each other with a fear which was only now being born within them, but which they knew would grow into the beast that would devour them if they found no evidence of escape. Hendrix supernova. The black hole